The outside body was a reflection of one's interior to understand what was happening inside for health and balance. Well-being meant being able to harmonize one's body in relation to dynamic relations between vital substances, human organs, and one's environment to live as long as possible. The immune system and microbiome are contemporary examples. They help to understand human bodies in relation to entities such as bacteria, microbes, or pathogens. These offer key opportunities to reframe body ideals that engage vitality from within, such as metabolic health, rather than focus solely on externalities or ideal representations. We are in dire need of healthy bodies, societies, and environments. We come in all shapes and features that are desirable and beautiful. By caring for healthy bodies, placing more value on internal vitality, which takes into account living in relation to our environment and each other, we might be able to experience better health and collective well-being in this century. We can begin to heal by looking within ourselves. We can thrive by seeing vitality together. One of the social issues faced by the state of Alaska is the lack of mental and emotional well-being of the Native Alaskans. It is very unfortunate that many of the Native Americans are living under poor conditions throughout the country. In the cases of Native Alaskans, even virtually entire villages are suffering from a lack of mental and emotional well-being, which includes continuing poor physical and mental health. Alcohol abuse, domestic violence, homicides, and suicides are frequent among them, which of course, lead to families falling apart. It is tragic to see that many children are abused and not educated properly. As a matter of fact, the children themselves are abusing alcohol and other chemicals, and the rate is increasing over the time. Since parents are suffering from mental illnesses and alcohol abuse, they can't take care of their children, so many children are being taken care of by others or simply neglected. Therefore, we can conclude that Alaskan Natives are losing hold of their communities, cultural identities, and most importantly, their childhoods. So you can see how serious the issue is. Plus, rather than making a living for themselves, they are depending on public services and subsidies. They have lost control of and responsibility for their economy and governing institutions. But you can see from the relatively crooked and narrow streets of the city of Rome as they look from above today, you can see that again, the city grew in a fairly ad hoc way, as I mentioned. It wasn't planned all at once. It just grew up over time, beginning in the 8th century BC. Now this is interesting. Because what we know about the Romans is when they were left to their own devices and they could build the city from scratch, they didn't let it grow in an ad hoc way. They structured it in a very methodical way. That was basically based on military strategy, military planning. The Romans, they couldn't have conquered the world without obviously having a masterful military enterprise. And everywhere they went on their various campaigns, their various military campaigns. They would build camps, and those camps were always laid out in a very geometric plan along a grid, usually square or rectangular. For centuries, boys were top of the class. But these days, that's no longer the case. A new study by the OECD, a club of mostly rich countries, examined how 15-year-old boys and girls performed at reading, mathematics, and science. Boys still score somewhat better at maths, and in science the genders are roughly equal. But when it comes to the students who really struggle, the difference is stark. Boys are 50% more likely than girls to fall short of basic standards in all three areas. Researchers suggest that doing homework set by teachers is linked to better performance in maths, reading, and science. Boys, it appears, spend more of their free time in the virtual world. They are 17% more likely than girls to play collaborative online games than girls every day. They also use the internet more. Third, peer pressure plays a role. A lot of boys decide early on that they are just too cool for school, which means they're more likely to be rowdy in class. Teachers mark them down for this. In anonymous tests, boys perform better. In fact, the gender gap in reading drops by a third when teachers don't know the gender of the pupil they are marking. So what can be done to close this gap? Getting boys to do more homework and cut down on screen time would help. But most of all, abandoning gender stereotypes would benefit all students. Boys in countries with the best schools read much better than girls. And girls in Shanghai excel in mathematics. They outperform boys from anywhere else in the world. I understand your professor has been discussing several eastern woodland Indian tribes in your study of Native American cultures. As you have probably learned, the eastern woodland Indians get their name from the forest-covered areas of the eastern United States where they lived. The earliest woodland cultures date back 9,000 years, but the group will focus on dates back only to about 700 AD. We now call these Native Americans the Mississippian culture, because they settled in the Mississippi River Valley. This civilization is known for its flat-topped monuments called temple mounds. They were made of earth and used as temples and official residences. The temple mounds were located in the central square of the city, with the huts of the townspeople built in rows around the plaza. The Mississippian people were city dwellers. But some city residents earned their living as farmers, tending the fields of corn, beans, and squash that surrounded the city. The city's artisans made arrowheads, leather goods, pottery, and jewelry. Traders came from far away to exchange raw materials for these items. In the slides I'm about to show, you will see models of a Mississippian city. Child language acquisition, 3 little words. So let's take them on at a time. Child, when to start being a child. For many people, language acquisition starts around about 12 months when kids say that first word, but don't forget the first year. At the first year, our first year of life is very important as well, and indeed before you are born. Remember, there are couple of months before you are born, when you actually able to perceive in the womb, something of the language that's around you. So language acquisition starts earlier than most people think. And it also ends later than most people think. When does child language acquisition stop? Well, in a sense, we are all children. We stay being children all in our lives. There is no obvious endpoint for learning sounds. Of course, there is for learning grammar, there is for vocabulary. Hey! I mean, that goes on for the rest of our lives in million or more words in English. Most of us only have a vocabulary of 50, 60, 70,000 words, whatever it is, until there is always something to learn. So remember that two ends of child language acquisition are wider apart than some people think. That means there is more scope for studying in it than most people think. There comes a time in a desert ant's life when a piece of food is too large to ignore, but too heavy to lift, and the only way to get it home is to adopt a new style of walking. The long-legged and speedy Cataglyphis fortis normally covers ground with a three-legged stride that moves two legs forwards on one side, and one on the other. For the next step, the insect mirrors the move with its other three legs. But recordings of ants in the Tunisian desert reveal that when faced with oversized lumps of food 10 times their own weight, the forward tripod walking style is abandoned. Unable to lift the morsels in their mandibles, the ants drag the food backwards instead, moving all 6 legs independently. This is the first time we have seen this in any ants, said lead author Sarah Pfeffer at the University of Ulm in Germany. The ants' long legs already help keep their bodies away from the scorching desert floor and enable them to speed around at up to 60 centimeters per second. Think of Usain Bolt, who has very long legs compared to body size. The desert floor is also very hot, so the further away their bodies are from the surface, the better, said co-author Matthias Wittlinger. The ants have also evolved to function at body temperatures of 50 C in a desert where temperatures can soar to 70 C. They're basically just trying to get out of the heat, he added. Over the last decade, the share of the world's population living under autocracy increased from 48 to 68%. It is more important than ever to understand how autocracies work. Autocrats have a keen interest in promoting the idea that they are all-powerful. Whereas leaders in democracies can be removed via elections, leaders in autocracies can lose office in 2 ways: via a coup or popular revolt. To make matters worse, autocrats can rarely address both threats at the same time. They often have to choose whether to reward their elite cronies to prevent a coup or the masses to prevent a revolt. This generates many difficult trade-offs. Cheat too little on elections and risk losing office, but cheat too much and signal weakness to your opponents. Use corruption to reward your elite friends, but not so much that it slows economic growth and sparks a revolt. Manipulate the media, but not so much that people turn off the television. Repress your political opponents, but not so much that it causes a backlash. Empower the security services, but not so much that they can overthrow you. Rulers who fail to resolve these trade-offs often suffer the consequences. Are you a chocolate lover? Even true chocoholics might not know what their favorite treat has in common with yogurt, cheese, and wine. Its flavors come from fermentation. Fermentation is the process of improving a food through the controlled activity of microbes. The food you know as chocolate starts its life as the seeds of football-shaped fruit. Farmers scoop out the seeds and pulp into piles or boxes. The seeds are now called cacao beans. They ferment for about a week before they're dried, roasted, and crushed with sugar until smooth and ready to eat. Let's go back to that fermentation step. Cacao fermentation is a multi-stage process. The first stage involves yeast. Just like the yeast in your beer, yeast in a cacao fermentation produces alcohol by digesting the sugary pulp around the beans. As the pulp breaks down, oxygen seeps in. And oxygen-loving bacteria take over. The bacteria generate acetic acid from the alcohol that the yeast produced. Acetic acid causes biochemical changes as it soaks into the beans, and that has a major impact on flavor. Finally, as the acid slowly evaporates and the sugars are all used up, spore-forming organisms begin to grow. Cacao is a wild fermentation. Farmers rely on natural microbes in their environment to create unique, local flavors. So the pace, at which human minds have evolved over the last 500,000 years and more recently the last 200,000 years, has been so frighteningly rapid that the evolution of cognitive function and perception can only occur in a small number of genes. If one needed to adapt dozens of genes changes in concert, in order to acquire the penetrating minds that we now have, which our ancestors 5,000 years ago didn't have, the evolution could not have taken place, it could not have occurred so quickly. And for that reason alone, one begins to really suspect that the genetic differences between people who lived 5,000 years ago is evidence that the difference between their cognitive functions and ours is not actually as large. Therefore, a rather small number of genes may be responsible for the powerful minds that humans have, which most of us now possess. Why the bumblebees pick some flowers over others. Researchers have known for a while that flowers' color can be a signal. Color in shorthand that says to a bee, "Hey, I get some good quality nectar here, want to stop by for a visit?" But new findings show that bees also use color to get clues about a flower's temperature. And according to a study from a British research team published in the journal Nature, some like it hot. Bees use up a lot of energy just staying warm on some days. In fact, they can't even fly if they are too cold. So if one flower is warmer than another, a bee can save some of its fuel by basking on that flower while it's doing its pollinating business. And it turns out that bumblebees consistently do choose warmer flowers over cooler ones, even when the two flowers offer up the same quantity and quality of nectar. Some plants seem to be evolutionarily adapted to be slightly warmer because the warmer ones get visited more by the chilly bees. When it comes to getting pollinated, apparently the heat is on, and that is the buzz. You might think that most of the patients at sleep clinics are being treated for sleeplessness, commonly referred to as insomnia, but that is not the case. The majority of sleep clinic patients suffer from disorders of excessive sleep, or hypersomnia. While most insomniacs somehow manage to drag themselves through the day and function at acceptable, although not optimal levels, this is not so for people who suffer from hypersomnia. They are incapacitated by irresistible urges to sleep during the day, often in inappropriate situations at business meetings, in supermarkets, or at parties. Even more dangerous is their failure to remain awake when driving or operating machinery. Falling asleep in such situations could obviously be life-threatening. Many hypersomniacs suffer from narcolepsy, for which the primary symptom is excessive daytime sleepiness. Though not apparent in childhood, this symptom most often appears for the first time during the teen years and continues throughout a person's life. The sleep attacks may occur as many as 15 to 20 times during the course of the day and last for periods from 15 minutes up to 2 hours. What can be done to help those suffering from narcolepsy? There are certain drugs that can help, and specialists suggest voluntary napping to decrease the frequency of such sleep attacks. Look at any photo of Earth's night sight, and you see the planet lit up like a Christmas decoration. As the glowing lights of bustling cities expand, the serenity of natural darkness wanes. But the repercussions are not just the loss of the starry night sky. Light pollution also affects animals who depend on a nighttime environment to survive. Many bird species use the stars to navigate at night. Baby sea turtles use moonlight reflected off the ocean to guide them back to the water. City lights can confuse them, and veer them off course. Humans are not immune, either. Excessive exposure to artificial light at night can increase the risk of sleep disorders, and it's also been linked to obesity, depression, diabetes, and even cancer. Paris is very old. There has been a settlement there for at least 6,000 years, and its shape has been determined in part by the river Seine, and in part by the edicts of France's rulers. But the great boulevards we admire today are relatively new, and were constructed to prevent any more barricades being created by the rebellious population. That work was carried out in the middle 19th century. The earlier Paris had been in part a maze of narrow streets and alleyways. But you can imagine that the work was not only highly expensive, but caused great distress among the 500,000 or so residents whose houses were simply razed, and whose neighborhoods disappeared. What is done cannot usually be undone, especially when buildings are torn down. Most people think of astronomers as people who spend their time in cold observatories peering through telescopes every night. In fact, a typical astronomer spends most of his or her time analyzing data and may only be at the telescope a few weeks of the year. Some astronomers work on purely theoretical problems and never use a telescope at all. You might not know how rarely images are viewed directly through telescopes. The most common way to observe the skies is to photograph them. The process is very simple. First, a photographic plate is coated with a light-sensitive material. The plate is positioned so that the image received by the telescope is recorded on it. Then the image can be developed, enlarged, and published so that many people can study it. Because most astronomical objects are very remote, the light we receive from them is rather feeble. But by using a telescope as a camera, long-time exposures can be made. In this way, objects can be photographed that are 100 times too faint to be seen by just looking through a telescope. In today's class we'll be examining some 19th century pattern books that were used for building houses. I think it's fair to say that these pattern books were the most important influence on the design of North American houses during the 19th century. This was because most people who wanted to build a house couldn't afford to hire an architect. Instead, they bought a pattern book, picked out a plan, and took it to the builder. The difference in cost was substantial. In 1870, for example, hiring an architect would have cost about $100. At the same time, a pattern book written by an architect cost only $5. At that price, it's easy to see why pattern books were so popular. Some are back in print again today, and of course they cost a lot more than they did 100 years ago. But they're an invaluable resource for historians, and also for people who restore old houses. I have a modern reprint here that I'll be passing around the room in a moment so that everyone can have a look. The history of software is of course very new. And the whole IT industry is really only 67 years old, which is extraordinary, and to be so close to the birth of a major new technology, a major new discipline, is quite remarkable given where we got to in those 67 years. And the progression has been not so much a progression as a stampede, because Moore's law, the rapid expansion in the power of computing and the rapid fall of the cost of computing and storage and communications, has made it feasible for information technology to move into all sorts of areas of life that were never originally envisaged. What has happened is that there has been, as I said, a stampede for people to pick the low-hanging fruit. And that is what's guided the development of software and information technology over the past decades, and continues to do so, with a number of consequences that we will explore. Well, what I want to focus on now is climate change, more specifically on the fact that climate change is a result of human activities. Now, there has been some disagreement regarding the extent to which human activity can be blamed for climate change, but I want to argue that there is evidence which clearly demonstrates that our own actions really are causing a genuine threat. The available evidence seems to indicate fairly conclusively that land and sea temperatures started to increase around 200 years ago. So, what's the significance of this? Well, 200 years ago roughly coincides with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the Northern Hemisphere. In other words, this was when our production of harmful gases really got going as a result of increased industrialization. Since that time, our production of gases has accelerated due to the fact that not only has industry grown in size, but it has also now spread to the southern hemisphere, indeed, most parts of the world. So, in the last 200 years, as industry has grown, we can see a gradual rise in the temperatures, which, to my mind, is sufficient proof of the damaging effect of our actions, and needless to say, it's an issue which we need to address. To be a successful entrepreneur, you should have good ideas, but the definition of a good idea varies depending on whom you ask. A great idea should have several features. Firstly, the great idea should be various and novel. Secondly, the great idea should be unique, which means no one has thought about it. Thirdly, it is essential for great ideas to be transformative and productive. All ideas are essentially a combination of other smaller ideas, but this doesn't mean they can't be unique. Merely copying doesn't make anything idiosyncratic, it's the individuality that one puts in which makes a concept stand out. Constant innovation leaves no room for stagnation and thus, adds on to the basic idea, effectively making it unique. Unique ideas are inspired by basic things, they are simply extensions of pre-existing notions. And, an idea or a concept is unique only when it transcends its predecessor and serves its purpose in a better and more precise way. Many parents communicate and educate their children with two languages, probably because they both know more than one language, or they come from different countries. Most of these parents think this can benefit their children's language learning. But actually kids will get confused when their parents use different languages from each other to describe the same object. If one parent sticks to one language, and the other one sticks to another language, their children will not be confused anymore.